The glass doors of the emergency room reflected the light, and I saw my own pale face. My phone was pressed against my ear, burning hot, and James's voice, traveling across thousands of miles and 5 years, still pierced through me like an ice pick. I looked down at my slightly protruding belly, 4 months along, just starting to show. The nurse was calling, "Tina. Is Tina's family here?" I slammed the phone down, my palms sweating. Family? What family? The father of the one in my belly just told me over the phone to get rid of it. My name is Tina. This thing in my belly is the last souvenir from before James and I broke up. Back then, he was busy cultivating a relationship with his well-matched childhood friend, and news of the two families planning a marriage alliance was everywhere. Me? I'm his secret lover, the one he keeps in the shadows and can discard whenever he gets bored. The day we broke up was quite peaceful. He gave me a card with a substantial amount, calling it compensation. I took it without making a fuss, then turned around and blocked and deleted all his contact information. A month later, I was throwing up constantly, and when I got checked, I was pregnant. I didn't hesitate then. Holding that card, should I find a place where nobody knows me, give birth and raise the child myself? Or listen to those 2 cold words from James on the phone just now, get rid of it? I touched my belly, and the little one inside seemed to know I was thinking about it, giving a gentle nudge. Just that one small movement, and tears suddenly streamed down my face. Fuck James, this is my own flesh and blood, and I'll make my own decisions. I clutched that card and ran as fast as I could. James's influence was vast, but the world is vast too, and if you really want to disappear, it's not impossible. I found a small coastal town in the south, not big, but comfortable. With that money, I started a small baking studio called Cereal Baking. The one in my belly, little name is George. I hope his life can be cereal baking, sufficiently full, not overflowing, nor lacking. The day George was born, I went into the delivery room alone. When the pain was tearing me apart, all I could think about was James's cold face and his words, "Get rid of it." This hatred sustained me as I gave birth to George. 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a really loud cry. The nurse placed him in my arms, a tiny, soft bundle, wrinkled like a little old man, but those eyes, dark and bright, were so much like James's. Holding him, I cried and laughed at the same time. From that moment on, my world consisted of only me and this little one. Time flies by. George has grown from a soft little baby into a little mischief maker who can climb roofs and tear down tiles. My cereal baking studio has also gone from barely making ends meet to having some loyal customers. Life is simple, but it's solid and fulfilling. George is my everything, my little sunshine. In the spring of the year George turned 5, he suddenly became listless, always complaining of leg pain. At first, I thought it was just growing pains and didn't pay much attention. Later, the pain became so severe that I couldn't sleep at night. My little face turned deathly pale, and I developed a low-grade fever. I was taken to the community hospital where the doctor frowned after examining me for a long time and told me to rush to the city's major hospital for a checkup. The result was like a bolt from the blue. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Those words crashed down on me, my vision went black, and I nearly collapsed on the spot. Whatever treatment plan, prognosis, or costs the doctor mentioned afterward, my ears were buzzing, and I only caught a few words: chemotherapy, bone marrow transplant, hundreds of thousands or even millions. My cereal baking studio earns just over $100,000 a year, barely enough for my child and me to get by in our small town. Several $100,000? Over $1 million? I couldn't fill that hole even if I died trying. Looking at George on the hospital bed, temporarily asleep after a painkiller shot, his little face having thinned by a whole circle, my heart was torn to pieces. Going back to that big city was the only choice. It had the best pediatric hematology department, and more importantly, I had to find James. He was George's biological father, the greatest hope for a successful bone marrow match, and the only one who could afford the astronomical medical expenses. For George, I had to swallow my pride and all past resentment. I sold my studio at a low price, and with all my belongings and a sickly George, I boarded the train heading north. 5 years later, stepping onto this land again, the air carries a heavy sense of oppression. After settling George into the hospital, he began the painful chemotherapy. Watching the needle pierce his tiny veins, he trembled in pain, biting his lip to keep from crying out, only looking at me with those eyes so similar to James and whispering, "Mommy, George is brave." I turned away, digging my nails into my palm to keep the tears from flooding down. Finding James became more torturous for me than chemotherapy. The circle he moves in isn't one that someone who's been out of sight for 5 years can easily break into. Like a headless fly, I staked out the high-end clubs he used to frequent and the area below his company building, but came up empty-handed. He changed his car, changed his driver, and even changed the restaurants he frequented. I even mustered up the courage to try contacting his childhood friend Miss Zara. The call went through, but as soon as I gave my name, she sneered and hung up. When I called back, all I got was a busy signal. Money flowed out like water. Chemotherapy costs, hospital fees, various examination expenses, my meager savings couldn't last more than a few days. My credit card was maxed out, and I had borrowed from every relative and friend I could, but it was just a drop in the bucket. An overwhelming despair, like cold tide water, gradually engulfed me. That afternoon, George had just finished a bone marrow aspiration and cried until his voice was hoarse before finally falling asleep. I sat on the cold bench downstairs in the hospital, scrolling through my phone contacts, finding nothing but a blank screen. The sky was gloomy and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. As if possessed, I dialed a number that was etched in my mind but hadn't dared to touch for 5 years. Ring, ring. Each sound struck my heart. To my surprise, the call connected. A deep male voice came through. "Who is this?" "It's James." His voice is deeper and more imposing than 5 years ago. My hands are trembling violently, my throat is tight, and I can't utter a single word. It's been 5 years, I thought I hated him to the core, but hearing his voice at this moment, immense grievance and fear instantly overwhelmed me. "Speak." His tone grew colder. "James." My voice trembled uncontrollably, thick with tears. "It's me, Tina." The line fell instantly silent. After several seconds, he seemed to find his voice again, icy and piercing, thick with mockery and disgust. "Tina? You dare to call me? Disappeared for 5 years, ran out of money?" He thought I was here to ask for money. A huge sense of humiliation made me shiver. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood, just to suppress the urge to smash the phone. "For George, Tina, you have to endure." "No. James, I took a deep breath, my nails digging deep into the flesh of my palm. "I need your help. Please, save our child." "What child?" He laughed as if he'd heard the most ridiculous joke. "Tina, are you insane? I paid the breakup money clearly, and we've been even for a long time. Don't use such a pathetic excuse to me. I've seen plenty of women like you. I'm not lying to you. It's true," I said desperately as tears streamed down my face. "His name is George, he's 5 years old, and he's sick, very sick. Leukemia. He needs a bone marrow transplant, he needs money to save his life. James, he's your son. Your biological son." "Enough." James cut me off sharply, his voice filled with undisguised rage and contempt. "At least make your story more believable. Why didn't you mention this when we broke up 5 years ago? Now you're short on money, so you come up with a bastard to blackmail me? Tina, you disgust me completely. Don't bother me again." Beep, beep, beep. The busy tone came through, like a cold knife. I stood at the bustling hospital entrance, phone in hand, my body ice cold as if plunged into a frozen cave. The sunlight was blinding, yet all I could see was darkness. He didn't believe me. He called George a bastard. He said I was disgusting. With his own hands, he extinguished my last glimmer of hope. The days that followed were hell. There was no hope left with James. The high medical bills were like a mountain pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The payment notices came one after another. During the day, I take care of George at the hospital, watching him being tormented by chemotherapy, losing clumps of hair and becoming skin and bones. At night, I go out to find work. What can I do? My meager baking skills are completely useless for finding a decent job in this big city. Time doesn't allow it either, so I can only work overnight shifts at convenience stores, help people move goods at the early morning market, and do hourly paid cleaning in office buildings. I get less than 3 or 4 hours of sleep a day. When I'm completely exhausted, I sit by George's hospital bed, holding his little hand with the 4-needle, watching his brows occasionally furrow in pain during his sleep. James's cold, disgusted face would appear before my eyes. Hatred grew wildly like vines, entwining my heart. Why? Why did he live in luxury and stand high above while my George had to endure such suffering? Why didn't he believe? Why did he call George a bastard? This hatred sustained me, like a string stretched to its absolute limit. That day, George's white blood cell count was frighteningly low. The doctor issued a critical condition notice. He needed an immediate platelet transfusion, otherwise there was a risk of intracranial hemorrhage. The money in my account wasn't even enough to buy a single imported white blood cell boosting injection. I searched through all my cards and all my payment apps, but the balances were all glaring zeros. I rushed to the ATM machine downstairs at the hospital and inserted my last bank card. That was the breakup money card James gave me back then. When I left, I transferred the money out but kept the card, like a shameful memento. The balance shows 3.21 yuan. Overwhelming despair and hatred instantly consumed me. Like a madman, I screamed at the cold machine screen with all my strength, "James! You bastard! You scoundrel! That's your son! Your own flesh and blood! He's dying! Are you satisfied now? Are you satisfied now?" My voice echoed through the empty self-service bank, filled with desperate, blood-curdling sorrow and madness. After screaming, I felt as if all my strength had been drained, collapsing beside the cold machine, hugging my knees and wailing loudly. What I didn't know was that the VIP elevator doors in the hospital lobby happened to open at that very moment. James, dressed in a well-tailored dark gray suit, walked out surrounded by several equally well-dressed people. He was here at this hospital to discuss an investment in high-end medical equipment. My desperate screams and cries, like thunder, clearly crashed into his ears. His footsteps suddenly halted, his sharp gaze cutting through the crowd to precisely lock onto the frail figure huddled on the ground in the self-service bank, trembling and crying. 5 years had passed, and she had become almost unrecognizable. Pale, haggard, and emaciated beyond recognition, she was like a withered leaf that could be blown away by the wind at any moment. Yet that desperate cry, that bone-deep hatred, seared his heart like a red-hot branding iron, leaving him breathless. "Tina?" His assistant followed his gaze and confirmed in a low voice, "It seems to be her," she just called out. James's face instantly turned extremely grim, his jawline clenched tightly. He didn't speak, nor did he move. He just stared fixedly in that direction, his gaze as complex as a passing storm. The assistant asked tentatively, "James? The partner is still waiting." James raised his hand, stopping the words that followed. He strode forward on his long legs, walking directly toward the self-service bank. His leather shoes tapped against the polished marble floor, emitting cold and heavy echoes. I cried until my vision went black, not noticing someone approaching. Until a huge shadow loomed over me, blocking the pale light above. A familiar, cold scent of cedar mixed with the sharp aroma of tobacco forcefully invaded my senses. I looked up abruptly. James was standing right in front of me, looking down at me from a higher position. 5 years had passed, and that sense of oppression from someone in power about him had grown even stronger. His eyes were as deep as a cold pool, now churning with turbulent waves I couldn't comprehend. His face was expressionless, but the tight line of his lips and clenched jaw betrayed the turmoil within him. "What did you just say?" His voice was low and hoarse, strained with suppressed tension. "Who's dying?" A tremendous shock and sense of humiliation instantly seized me. I never expected to see him again in such circumstances, in such a disheveled state. The furious shout from moments ago had exhausted all my strength, leaving only cold hatred and numbness. Leaning against the cold ATM machine, I struggled to stand, but my legs gave out, refusing to obey. I gave up trying and tilted my head back, my bloodshot eyes glaring at him, a twisted, hateful smile curling my lips. James? What a coincidence. Come to laugh at me? See me lying here like a stray dog? Satisfied now? You, the great CEO, can stomp my son and me to death more easily than an ant. Your son is dying. Do you hear me? That child you called a bastard. He's about to die. Are you happy now? Get out. Get the hell out of here. I used my last ounce of strength to roar the word get out, my chest heaving violently, my vision blurring with waves of darkness. James's expression completely darkened when I said your son is dying, becoming terrifyingly grim. The assistant and bodyguard behind him subconsciously took a step back. But he didn't move, nor did he get angry. Instead, he just fixed his sharp, knife-like gaze on my face, as if trying to discern the truth in my words and the extent of my madness. A few seconds of dead silence, the air stagnant and suffocating. Where is he? James's voice was cold as ice, leaving no room for doubt. I froze for a moment, followed by even greater anger and sorrow. At this point, what more did he want? To go and confirm for himself whether that bastard was really dying, just to satisfy his pathetic desire for control? None of your damn business. I hissed. James, put away that fake sympathy of yours. Whether my son and I live or die has nothing to do with you. Go back to your golden nest. James' eyes turned completely cold. He no longer looked at me, turning his head directly to his trembling assistant behind him and said harshly, investigate. Within 5 minutes, I want to know all the hospitalization records of pediatric patients named Tina in this hospital. Immediately. The assistant jumped in fright. Yes. James, and immediately took out his phone and ran to the side. What are you doing? I panicked, rushing forward to stop him. James. You have no right. Stay away from my son. James grabbed my flailing wrist. His grip was incredibly strong, crushing my bones until they ached, his cold gaze carrying absolute oppression. Tina, you'd better pray you're telling the truth. Otherwise, you won't be able to bear the consequences. He threw off my hand with such force that I staggered and crashed into the ATM. In less than 3 minutes, the assistant rushed back, looking pale, holding a mobile phone. James, I found it. He's on the 7th floor in the pediatric hematology department, intensive care unit. George, 5 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, just received a critical condition notice, urgently needs platelet transfusion, but the family's account has a serious arrears. James's expression changed drastically when he heard the words critical condition notice. He suddenly turned to look at me, his eyes swirling with astonishingly complex emotions, shock, disbelief, and even a hint of panic that he himself hadn't noticed. Lead the way. He growled at his assistant, not looking at me again as he strode toward the elevator. Ignoring the pain in my wrist and the hatred in my heart, I scrambled after him. I couldn't let him get near George. Who knows what he might do to my child? The elevator went straight to the 7th floor. James walked at a brisk pace, with his assistant jogging to keep up. I followed behind, panting, my heart in my throat. The atmosphere was oppressive at the entrance to the intensive care unit. The nurse looked a bit nervous as she saw our group approaching with such intensity. James paid no attention, his gaze piercing through the glass door to lock precisely on the small hospital bed inside. George's tiny body was buried under the white blanket, almost invisible. He wore an oxygen mask, his small face deathly pale, his hair thinned from chemotherapy, exposing his scalp. Several tubes were inserted in his arms and feet, while the nearby cardiac monitor emitted regular, faint beeping sounds. James' footsteps came to an abrupt halt before the glass door. His tall frame, for the first time, seemed somewhat rigid. He just stood there, motionless, staring through the glass at the fragile little life on the hospital bed that seemed as if it would shatter at the slightest touch. Time seemed to stand still. I stood a few steps behind him, watching his broad yet rigid back, my heart gripped tightly by an invisible hand, aching so much I could barely breathe. George, my George. I don't know how much time passed, perhaps only a few seconds, perhaps as long as a century. James slowly, extremely slowly turned around, his face still cold and hard, but in those deep eyes, something had completely shattered. Shock, confusion, an overwhelming panic, and a trace of indescribable pain? He looked at me, his eyes no longer cold and scrutinizing as before, but as if looking at a completely unfamiliar existence that he couldn't comprehend. James's Adam's apple rolled violently, his voice hoarse beyond recognition, carrying a tremor he himself didn't notice. He looks like me. Not a question, but a statement. With a daze as if struck by ironclad evidence and confirmation. All my hatred, grievance, and fear collapsed before his hoarsely spoken like me. Tears burst forth as I could no longer support myself, sliding down against the cold wall to the ground, covering my face as I cried out in grief. 5 years of forbearance, the hardship of supporting myself alone, the humiliation of being misunderstood and insulted, the helplessness of watching my child suffer, all these emotions erupted completely at this moment. James didn't move. He just stood there, listening to my heart-wrenching sobs, watching the child inside the glass door who shared his blood but was hanging by a thread. The cold, hard mask on his face finally began to crack, revealing an almost blank confusion and helplessness. The assistant approached cautiously, handing over a document. "Mr. President, the emergency platelets and the best imported white blood cell boosters will be delivered immediately. Also, this is the expedited paternity test report that the hospital just received. The results are out." He glanced at me, collapsed on the ground and crying, his voice dropping even lower. "Supporting. Mr. James is George's biological father." That thin report felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. James didn't take it, his gaze fixed intently on the few words in the conclusion section of the report. The assistant's hand froze in midair. The air was dead silent. Only my sobs echoed through the corridor, suppressed and desperate. After a long while, James slowly raised his hand and took the report. His knuckles had turned white from gripping it. He didn't open it to read the conclusion, just gripped the report tightly, his knuckles cracking, the veins on the back of his hand bulging one by one. He suddenly turned his head, no longer looking at the hospital room, no longer looking at the report, but staring fixedly at me, collapsed on the floor. That gaze was no longer cold, no longer filled with disgust, but churned with an extremely complex emotion that almost seemed ready to swallow him whole. Shock, anger, disbelief, and an intense regret that had almost become tangible, and panic. "Tina," his voice was as hoarse as sandpaper rubbing together, well done." It was unclear whether this sentence was spoken with teeth-gritting hatred or heart-wrenching regret. After speaking, he didn't look at me again, but turned sharply to his assistant and the hospital leaders who had hurried over. His voice was cold and sharp as a knife, carrying an unquestionable authority. "Use the best medicine. The best doctors. Money is not an issue. I want him to live. He must live." The following days were like a chaotic and oppressive dream. Money was no longer an issue. James's assistant, like a precision machine, quickly handled all the overdue payments, deposited a large sum for medical expenses, and brought in the nation's top pediatric hematology specialist team for consultation. The best medicine, the most sophisticated equipment, and the most professional care continuously surrounded little George. James practically lived at the hospital. He no longer spoke harshly to me, but we barely communicated. He spent most of his time in a separate lounge outside George's ward, watching the situation inside through surveillance screens or silently listening to doctors' reports. He was shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere, with gloomy eyes and a short temper, making his assistants and medical staff walk on eggshells. The look he gave George was incredibly complicated. There was the shock and clumsiness of a new father, albeit 5 years late, the deep pain of watching his child suffer, and an overwhelming sense of regret and self-blame. But he never went inside. When George was awake, he would only watch from a distance outside the door. When George was asleep, he would silently enter, standing by the bedside for a very long time, his fingers hovering above George's pale little face, yet never daring to touch down. Once, under the side effects of medication, George was vomiting violently, his little face turning blue and purple. I frantically wiped him clean, crying my eyes out with heartache. James rushed in at some point, roughly pushing aside the nurses in his way, and picked up George almost forcefully, clumsily yet firmly patting his back. George threw up all over his expensive suit, yet he didn't care at all, just with a tense face, the panic in his eyes almost overflowing. That was the first time he had truly touched George. After throwing up, George weakly leaned against him, drowsily opened his eyes, looked at the uncle before him who was both strange and somewhat familiar, and muttered softly, "Uncle, are you a superhero?" James froze abruptly. He looked down at the fragile little life in his arms, at that small face so similar to his own. His lips trembled violently a few times, but in the end, not a single word came out. He just held George even tighter, the muscles in his arms bulging. I stood by, watching this scene, my heart filled with mixed emotions. Did I hate him? Of course. But seeing George find a moment of peace in his arms, seeing the unconcealable panic and pain in his eyes, more complex emotions mingled with my hatred. The bone marrow matching results are out. James and George are a half match, which means a transplant is possible, but the risk is higher than with a full match. Without any hesitation, James immediately signed the consent forms and began preparing for the transplant. Blood tests, mobilization injections. Throughout the entire process, he remained silent as a stone. On the eve of the transplant surgery, George's condition had stabilized slightly. James made a rare appearance in the hospital room, sitting by George's bedside. George rested in my arms, his big eyes curiously watching this Superman uncle who always appeared at the doorway, brought him many new toys and delicious treats, yet rarely spoke. "Uncle," George asked softly, his voice faint from weakness, "tomorrow, will George have to sleep for a long time? Will it hurt?" James looked into the child's clear eyes, his Adam's apple bobbing as his voice became unusually hoarse. "It won't hurt. You'll be fine after a good sleep. Uncle, we'll stay with you." George reached out with his small, frail hand and gently touched James' large hand resting by the bed. James flinched as if burned, his fingers curling slightly, but ultimately he didn't pull away. George's eyes curved into a smile, pale yet content. George isn't scared. With Mommy, and Uncle Superman." James abruptly turned his face away, his shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly. He stood up and left the hospital room as if fleeing. The surgery was long but successful. James's bone marrow stem cells were slowly transfused into George's body. James and I waited outside the operating room. He stood against the wall, motionless, like a cold statue. Only his clenched fists and slightly trembling fingertips betrayed the storm raging within him. When the doctor came out and announced the transplant procedure went smoothly, James's tense body finally relaxed abruptly. He staggered a step and was supported by his assistant. He raised his hand to wipe his face, and only then did I realize his forehead was covered in cold sweat. The postoperative rejection period was the most difficult ordeal to endure. George experienced high fever, severe intestinal rejection, skin rejection, and teetered on the brink of death several times. James mobilized all available resources, brought in top international experts for remote consultations, and used the most cutting-edge targeted drugs. Money flowed out like water, but he didn't even blink. He remained silent, but spent even more time waiting outside the hospital room. He no longer avoided entering the hospital room, though his movements remained awkward. He would clumsily moisten George's lips with a water-dampened cotton swab to ease the pain from oral rejection. When George became irritable and cried due to medication, he would use his deep voice to clumsily tell Superman stories. Even in the middle of the night, when George couldn't sleep soundly because of discomfort, he would imitate me, gently patting the child's back. George's way of addressing James also changed from Superman uncle to the dependent uncle. The wonder of their blood connection and James' awkward yet genuine companionship during this time made George instinctively drawn to him. One late night, George had another high fever with convulsions, and the situation was critical. Doctors and nurses rushed in to rescue him. I slumped in the hallway chair, shivering all over, without even the strength to cry. James paced anxiously back and forth in the hallway like a trapped beast, smoking one cigarette after another, with cigarette butts covering the floor. When the doctor came out again and said that the situation was temporarily stable, James slammed his fist against the cold wall with a muffled thud, his hand instantly a bloody mess. He turned around, his bloodshot eyes fixed on me, filled with fear, anger, at fate, and a bottomless pain. "Tina," his voice was hoarse and broken, heavy with nasal congestion, "why didn't you tell me back then?" The grievances, anger, and fear suppressed for 5 years were completely ignited by his belated question at this moment. I looked up, my bloodshot eyes meeting his gaze without flinching, my voice sharp with excitement. "Tell you? James? How could I tell you? Show up at your door with a pregnancy test? While you're busy planning your century wedding with Miss Zara? What am I in your eyes? A mistress you can just pay off? A nuisance that won't go away? If I told you, would you even believe me? Would you stand guard here like this, giving your all for him? You would just be like in that phone call 5 years ago, coldly telling me to get rid of it. Calling him a bastard. My accusations were like knives, stabbing him mercilessly." Under the pale hallway light, James's face instantly lost all color. His tall frame swayed, as if my words had struck him right in the vitals. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but couldn't utter a single word. In those eyes that were always filled with cold harshness and control, there now remained only overwhelming, irrefutable regret and pain. He looked at me, yet also seemed to look through me at the child in the hospital room whose life hung in the balance. Finally, he staggered back a step, leaning heavily against the cold wall, closed his eyes in pain, and his shoulders began to tremble uncontrollably. It was a silent breakdown. The collapse of a man accustomed to controlling everything and standing high above, completely shattered by belated fatherly love and immense regret. At that moment, seeing his pained expression, the hatred surging in my heart strangely subsided. In its place was a deeper exhaustion and desolation. The damage had been done, and no matter how much he regretted it now, the pain that George and I had endured alone for these 5 years could not be erased. Time passed day by day in torment. With top-tier medical resources and James's unconditional investment, George finally made it through the most dangerous rejection period. The fever subsided, the rejection reaction gradually eased, and a hint of color began to return to his pale little face. The doctor said the most difficult hurdle has been overcome. What remains is a long recovery and regular checkups. With the tension that had built up over months suddenly released, I felt as if my bones had been removed. Sitting by George's bedside, watching his peaceful sleeping face, tears silently flowed for a long time. James walked in. He also looked much more haggard, with stubble on his jaw and his expensive suit wrinkled, but the oppressive aura around him had dissipated considerably. He stood silently by the bed, watching the sleeping George, his gaze softer than ever before. "Is he asleep?" His voice was very soft, carrying a careful sort of probing. Just fell asleep." I wiped my tears, my voice still a bit hoarse. Silence fell in the hospital room. Only the rhythmic beeping of the monitor could be heard. After a long while, James spoke again, his voice low and strained. "Tina, we need to talk." I didn't look at him, my gaze still fixed on George. "Talk about what? Compensation? Or custody?" "James, George is my life. No one is taking him away from me." "That's not what I meant." James immediately denied, his tone carrying a hint of barely perceptible urgency. He paused, as if organizing his thoughts, his eyes filled with struggle and clumsy sincerity. "I know I've let you down. These 5 years and before. He seemed to be saying these words for the first time, extremely inarticulate, almost at a loss for words. "I'm a bastard. Finally, he said it lightly, yet it carried heavy weight. I twitched the corners of my mouth, saying nothing. A single bastard couldn't cancel out all those hurts. George, he needs the best follow-up treatment and rehabilitation environment. James looked at me, his eyes serious. If he stays here, I can give him the best medical resources, the best school, the best life. So? I interrupted him, my tone flat and emotionless. Buy your peace of mind with money? Or are you trying to use this to buy George away from me? No. James raised his voice, then seemed to realize something and lowered it. I don't want to take him away. I just want to make up for it. Want to take care of you. He struggled to get out the words, take care of you, looking at me with complicated eyes, filled with an expectation and apprehension that even he didn't fully understand. Make up for it? Take care of me? My heart felt as if it had been pricked by a needle. This tardy, condescending favor strikes me as both ironic and tragic. James, I looked up and truly met his eyes calmly for the first time. I'm grateful for everything you've done to help George survive. Really? Without your money and resources, he might not have been saved. I choked up, unable to continue. A glint flashed in James's eyes. But, I changed the subject, my tone becoming exceptionally clear and firm. This gratitude, and whether I'm willing to accept your so-called care, are two different things. George and I have survived for these 5 years without you. In the future, we will too. The light in James's eyes instantly dimmed, and his face darkened. What do you mean? You're going to run with him again? Run? I laughed with a hint of weary sarcasm. James, you think too highly of yourself. I don't need to run. I just want to go back to our own life. In that small southern town, there's my studio, our little house, and George's familiar companions. Life there is simple and peaceful. That's our real home. What's so good about there? Medical conditions? Educational resources? Which of them can compare to here? James' tone carried his usual assertiveness and lack of understanding. Tina, don't be impulsive. Think about the child's future. Future? I interrupted him again, my voice turning cold. James, in your eyes, is only money and status considered a future? George just narrowly escaped death. What he needs most right now is a stable environment, familiar people, and a peaceful life, not to be dragged into your complicated world. I don't want him to carry the label of illegitimate child at such a young age. Nor do I want him to live in your shadow or become a tool for you to alleviate your guilt. My words were like ice picks, making James's face turn ashen. He clenched his fists, his jawline tensed tightly, obviously enraged by my words. He was accustomed to being in control, accustomed to having others act according to his will. My defiance and ingratitude clearly exceeded his expectations. What do you mean, my shadow? What do you mean, a tool? He took a step closer, his presence intimidating. I am his father. You are his biological father. I met his gaze without backing down. This doesn't change the fact that you've been absent for 5 years. Nor does it change the fact that you didn't want him from the beginning, and even insulted him. James, fatherly love can't be bought by signing a few checks or calling in some experts. What George needs is companionship, a sense of security, and a simple, happy environment. Can you provide these things? Can you put aside your company, your identity, to play with him in the sandbox, watch childish cartoons with him, and hold and comfort him when he has nightmares in the middle of the night? My series of questions struck James like heavy hammers. His tall body froze, and the anger in his eyes was replaced by a deeper sense of confusion and powerlessness. He opened his mouth to argue, but found that the business acumen and principles that once dominated the corporate world seemed so pale and ridiculous in the face of such simple yet profound requests like playing with sand or putting the child to sleep. He couldn't provide that. At least not now. Silence fell over the hospital room once again. There was only our silent standoff and the monotonous beeping of the monitor. The strength and anger in James's eyes gradually faded, eventually turning into a deep, almost defeated grayness. He staggered back a step and leaned against the window. The neon lights of the city outside reflected on his face, flickering uncertainly. After a long while, he finally spoke in an extremely hoarse voice, filled with frustration and a kind of exhaustion he had never known before. "So what do you plan to do? When George's condition stabilizes a bit more and the doctor says he can be discharged home to recuperate, we'll return to South City." My voice was calm, yet carried an unmistakable determination. "I will bring him back for regular follow-up treatments. The expenses, consider it a loan from you. I will pay you back." "Still?" James looked as if he had heard some joke, a bitter curve forming at the corner of his mouth. "Tina, do you think I care about that little money?" "I do." I looked into his eyes and said, word by word, "I don't want to owe you. Especially a favor." James stared at me fixedly, his gaze complex and difficult to decipher. There was anger, resentment, frustration, but ultimately, all were overshadowed by a deeper, more powerless emotion. It was as if he was truly and seriously examining the woman before him for the first time. No longer the submissive, well-behaved lover who depended on him in the past, but now a mother who would risk everything for her child, so resilient that it startled him. A woman he had once discarded like worthless trash, whom he could no longer control. He was silent for a very, very long time. So long that the sky outside the window began to lighten. Finally, he let out a long, extremely weary sigh, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "All right." The word "good" seemed to exhaust all his strength. He no longer looked at me, his gaze turning to George sleeping soundly on the hospital bed, his eyes filled with a thick, inseparable mixture of attachment and pain. "Tina," he spoke again, his voice as light as a sigh, carrying an almost humble plea, "let me occasionally see him. Would that be all right?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked at George, who had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep on the hospital bed, his small chest rising and falling slightly with each breath. Then I looked at the man by the window who seemed to have aged so much overnight, the regret and pleading in his eyes so real, so heavy. Hatred could never erase blood ties. George needed a father, even if this father came late and was terribly wrong. After a long while, I finally nodded slightly. James's tense body seemed to relax a little at this small gesture. He gave George a deep look, as if trying to etch the child's appearance into the depths of his soul. Then, without saying another word, he turned and silently left the hospital room. His figure disappeared at the doorway, carrying an unprecedented desolation. 1 month later. George's recovery exceeded the doctor's expectations. Although still thin and weak, requiring careful care and regular checkups, his spirits had improved considerably, and smiles had returned to his small face. The doctor finally nodded, approving his discharge to continue recuperating at home. James sent his assistant to arrange a special car to take us to the airport. He didn't show up himself. At the airport security checkpoint, I was holding George's hand, ready to go in. George suddenly stopped and looked around. "Mom," he whispered, "isn't Uncle coming to see me off?" I crouched down and stroked his head, which was growing a bit of fuzzy new hair. "Uncle is very busy." "Be good, George, let's go home." George let out a somewhat disappointed "oh," but obediently followed me forward. Just as we were about to pass through the security gate, a deep, familiar voice suddenly came from behind us, "George." George and I turned around at the same time. James was standing by a pillar not far away. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple black cashmere sweater and trousers. His posture was still upright, but without that imposing manner, he looked somewhat travel-worn. In his hand, he held a large, colorfully wrapped box. He walked over in a few steps, crouched down in front of George, and handed him the box, speaking in a very gentle voice, "This is for you. To play with on the way." George's eyes lit up. It was Lego. The latest fire station set that he had always wanted. "Thank you, Uncle." He happily took it and hugged it to his chest. James looked at George's smiling face, his eyes incredibly soft. He reached out as if wanting to touch George's face, but stopped halfway, eventually just patting his shoulder gently. "Go back, listen to Mom. Take good care of yourself." George is the best. George nodded vigorously. James stood up, his gaze finally landing on my face. That look was incredibly complex, filled with too many unspoken words. 1,000 words and phrases ultimately dissolved into one dry sentence: be careful on the road. Let me know when you arrive. I nodded, thank you. No unnecessary pleasantries. I took George by the hand and turned into the security channel. Once inside, I subconsciously glanced back. James was still standing there, his tall figure seeming somewhat lonely in the bustling airport lobby. He was watching us intently through the glass, his gaze closely following George's small figure. Even after we disappeared around the corner, he still stood there, not moving for a long time. The plane soared into the clouds, leaving behind the city that had borne so much pain, struggle, and complicated entanglements. Returning to the small southern town, life got back on track, yet something was different. Cereal baking bakery studio reopened. The regular customers knew about George's illness and gave the business special support, also bringing many small gifts. George's body is slowly recovering. Although he's thinner than children his age, his spirits are getting better and better, and he started being mischievous again. James kept his promise. He would call occasionally, dialing me directly to ask about George in a few concise words. He would regularly send money for George's follow-up checkups and rehabilitation, with the amount precise to the cent, neither more nor less. He never mentioned asking us to come back, nor did he interfere in our lives. He only makes arrangements at the hospital in advance and then happens to appear there each quarter when George needs to return to the big city for important checkups. He doesn't enter the ward, just waits in the corridor or the lounge. After the examination is done, he will happen to drive us to the airport, bringing George a new toy or a box of his favorite snacks along the way. George went from calling him uncle at the beginning to later actively sharing interesting stories from kindergarten, chattering like a little sparrow. James still didn't talk much, but he would listen attentively, occasionally responding with a word or two awkwardly, his eyes always fixed on the child, focused and gentle. After a follow-up visit, on the way to the airport, George, tired from playing, fell asleep in my arms. The car was very quiet. James sat in the passenger seat, looking through the rearview mirror at the sleeping child and me in the back seat. After a long silence, he suddenly spoke in a low voice, "Isn't the air in Nanching better than over there?" I froze for a moment, looking out the window at the familiar, salty humid air, and nodded, "Yeah, it's better." Another silence fell. James paused, as if weighing his words, seems to have grown a bit taller. Children grow up so fast. I replied casually. James's voice dropped lower, with a rare hesitation and awkwardness. "The studio, are you still managing? Do you want to hire someone to help?" I watched his profile, slightly turned, reflected in the rearview mirror, the tense line of his jaw betraying his nervousness. Suddenly, I understood. He was cautiously trying to understand our lives, awkwardly wanting to get a little closer. "It's fine, I can manage," I replied lightly, not continuing the conversation. James hummed in response, said nothing more, and turned his head away. But I saw his hand on his knee curl slightly, as if somewhat disappointed. Days flow by like a quiet stream. Resentment has long faded in George's healing smile day by day. Between James and me lie 5 years of emptiness and hurt, separated by completely different worlds, as if divided by an invisible wall. On both sides of this wall flows George's connected bloodline. I don't know if this wall will disappear, nor what the future holds. Perhaps it will remain this way, maintaining a distant yet inseparable connection because of the child. Maybe someday. That day, George made 3 lopsided little figures out of colored clay during his kindergarten craft class. He excitedly held them up to show me, "Mommy, look. This is you. This is George. This." He pointed to the tallest and ugliest little figurine and said in a slightly embarrassed whisper, "This is Uncle Superman. We're a family." My heart felt as if it had been gently touched. In the evening, after putting George to sleep, I sat by the window. The night breeze in the southern city carried a hint of warmth. My phone screen lit up with a message from James, just a simple line: "The follow-up appointment for next week has been scheduled, I've sent it to your email. The weather is getting colder, so dress warmly." I stared at that message for a long time. Then, I picked up my phone and, for the first time, took the initiative to reply to him with just a few simple words: "Got it. You be careful too." The message was sent successfully. Outside the window, the moonlight was like water. I knew that some things, like the moist sea breeze of the southern city, were changing silently. Perhaps slowly, perhaps with difficulty. But the three crooked little clay figures George molded, and the brief, emotionless words on the phone screen, made me feel that the river of life is, after all, quietly flowing towards some direction. As for where the future will lead, I lowered my head, looked at George sleeping soundly on the bed, and gently stroked his warm little face. Who knows what will happen in the future? Let's take it one step at a time.